Good evening, and thank you everybody for coming. Let me introduce myself. My name is Laura Arricchio. I'm the Dean of the School of Undergraduate Studies at the New School for Public Engagement, and I have the great privilege of welcoming you tonight on behalf of the New School to the event which is entitled Memory, Authenticity, Scale, Emotion, a discussion with the architects of the National September 11th Memorial Museum. We've actually had two previous public programs here at the New School addressing issues related to the events of September 11th. Both of them, like this evening's event, were sponsored by the Global Studies program at the New School. The first of those was on the 10th anniversary of September 11th, and the second was this past September. We had an event for a book entitled Battle for Ground Zero by Elizabeth Greenspan. That was just this past September. So that makes this the third in an unintended series of events dedicated to the subject. That said, it's an unintended series, but not at all a haphazard one, because the matters that we're discussing are really central to what we as a university and as the Global Studies program in particular are truly committed to, which is we're committed to addressing concerns of local importance that are also local concerns of global importance and global concerns of local importance. And of course, all of the matters related to the World Trade Center site fall into that category. Moreover, as a university, we not only place ourselves in these conversations, but we actively embrace our role, and always have since our founding, as a forum for engaging the public in conversations of matters of crucial significance. Moreover, tonight's event is particularly relevant to us because the New School, which includes as our largest unit Parsons School of Design, views design as an active agent in shaping the world, and that's very much what we're going to be discussing this evening. This building in particular also has very personal memories for many of us related to the site of September 11th, because many people who work in this building actually watch the towers come down from the building. And for the past 13 years, we've been watching the buildings rise up from our south-facing windows, so that we've actually been part of this process of the buildings going down and up has actually been an experience that we've lived through as part of our daily lives here. And process is in fact what we're going to be focusing on today. So just a note about what we will and won't be discussing. The gentleman we have with us today, representing Davis Brody Bond, the architects of the September 11th Museum, will be speaking with us. They'll be speaking about the space, about how the space came to be, about the constraints that they faced, about the challenges that they faced, about the process and collaboration that they went through in the process of creating the space. It's important to note that the gentlemen who were responsible for creating the space are not the same people, it's not the same team that's responsible for the contents of the museum. They're not the curators, they're not the educators. These are the people who were charged with the task of designing the space that would ultimately house a changing series of exhibitions and educational programmings. So it's actually quite an interesting design challenge. They started this there was no director of the museum, so the museum, the space actually sort of existed before the museum did. Finally, I'd just like to close by just sharing with you a couple of ground rules. There will be no photography or recording permitted at this event. Also, questions and answers will be welcomed from the audience starting at around 6 p.m. You've all received index cards on your way in. We're asking you to please fill out those index cards with any questions you have, and at around 6 p.m., if you could please pass them, there will be ushers in the aisles. They will then pass them over to me, and I'll come up and read the questions and direct them to the speakers. So let me tell you just very briefly what the order of events will be. We're going to begin with a presentation by the architects. It will be followed by a discussion by the panel. and then we'll have about a half an hour of audience discussion. We'll wrap up at around 6:30 because to remind us that this is a university, we have about 500 students coming in at 7 o'clock because there's a lecture class actually taught by Joel Towers, who is an architect, and also the dean of Parsons School of Design is actually teaching that lecture at 7 o'clock, so we have to be out of here. So we don't want to have a logjam. Before I conclude, which will be to introduce the panels, I just want to give a few words of thanks to Jeffrey Volkowiak, Pam Tillis, Jonathan Bach, and Alexandra Delano, all of whom were very instrumental in making this event happen. And now I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the people who will be speaking with us. Stephen Davis, Carl Krebs, and Mark Wagner are the architects from Davis Brody Bond. We also have Marita Sturken, Professor of Media, Culture, and Communications at NYU, and Brigitte Sion, co-organizer of the Transdisciplinary Project on the Politics of Memory in Global Context at Columbia University's Committee on Global Thought. Rather than take up too much more time, I'd ask you to please consult the flyers for the rest of their bios, which are indeed fascinating and impressive, and please don't miss those. But for the moment, please join me in welcoming our guests for the evening.
Good afternoon, good evening. My mentor many years ago told me that there's no such thing as a great project. There are only great clients, and I see in this audience many people who constituted our client over the many years of this project, and I just want to acknowledge them and to say thank you. That it's really, it's been a great honor to work on this project. An estimated 2 billion people witnessed 9/11, and about a third of the world's population. But if you think about it, in 100 years, very few people will be alive who remember the day. So the story is really going to have to tell itself. The design of this museum involved a large, talented team, many, many people. So we began in December 2004, and really the three of us are the last members of this team. We are the original team, and we are going to cross the finish line next month, and it has always been a pleasure to work with these guys. In order to keep the team, this varied and large team, focused, and to have an armature for people to reference when they're making decisions and proposals in the course of this design, we came up with 4 important conceptual points: memory, authenticity, scale, and emotion. And so if you think about them individually for a second, memory, and particularly cultural memory, is a very interesting concept. If you think about the skyline, looking back from Brooklyn across the Brooklyn Bridge today, you don't see the Trade Center towers. But if you knew that the towers were there, and if you had seen them in the past, it is very hard to dissociate that memory from the view that you get today. So this kind of cultural memory is a very important aspect of this design. Authenticity. If you think about it, how many memorials get built in the site of the events that they're memorializing? Only a handful that I can think of. Hiroshima comes to mind immediately. The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe was built in Berlin intentionally at a distance from the site of the atrocity. And the Holocaust Museum in Washington is at a distance, and today they're installing and they're designing and conceptualizing an interpretive center. But we're not going to have an opportunity to do that because of the nature of this project. Scale is something that we often talk about. 9/11 was a threshold event, and I know we're going to come back to the idea of threshold, but historically it's a threshold event, and this museum design employs a strategy of progressive disclosure, which takes advantage of the scale, doesn't manipulate it, doesn't change it in any way. It's presented in its true nature. And of course, emotion. Webster defines emotion as the consequence of events on your state of mind. So the idea that those 4 conceptual bullet points gave a really good reference for all the members of the team to make decisions and proposals. And I think as we get further into this presentation, you'll see how the consistency of that way of working was particularly successful. Mark, I think you're going to begin.
First slide. As architects, we are trained to design a building or a structure to a physical site. And at the 9/11 Memorial, we had something very different. While we had some very difficult and challenging and complex physical attributes to our site, we also had to deal with a very heavy level of emotion and memory. And what we see, stick back. In the original construction of the towers, many of us have memories of the towers. We all, me personally, I'm a born and raised New Yorker. I grew up with the towers. I remember seeing them, and my grandfather, who was a builder in the city, being so proud that New York would have the tallest buildings in the world. So we have these memories that the buildings had a life of their own, and the buildings became iconic to all of us. As Stephen's pointing out, it's difficult to erase that icon from your memory, but as we saw on 9/11, very quickly that icon was stripped from us and transformed into something very different. We had the horrors of the day. We had heartbreaking stories that came in the news in the days to follow, but we also had incredible acts of heroism and inspiring stories that go with that. So in many ways, 9/11 is not just about the tragedy, but it is also about some of the positive things that did come out of it. The site itself is the authentic site. We had 16 acres of a hole in the ground after the cleanup, as we're seeing here in this slide. This slide was taken in about 2005, but the site really became this in spring or in May of 2002, and it remained that way. What we're seeing here is a view south. We're seeing an access ramp, construction access ramp at the very southern end. You can make out the plywood, which is covering what became known as the footprints of the towers. The towers themselves, when removed and cleared from the site, left a very strong footprint. What's most important is that this is the authentic site. I'll repeat, this is where the tragedy took place, where the attacks happened, where the lives were lost, where these heroic stories came forward. When we thought about building on the site, thinking about the authentic site, the big questions that came to mind is how do we preserve that authentic site? We know that as the memorial and as the redevelopment of the site around takes place, that site transforms. The lid gets put on the box, if you will. The memorial plaza gets built. But really what we wanted to do from a design perspective was preserve that authentic site, preserve the scale of the site. We also wanted to honor the memory and the emotion that came along with that site. The museum is not necessarily about buildings. It is about the people. It is about the stories. And the museum will be an active tool going forward to future generations to remember the events of 9/11. When the memorial was designed, and we later saw it through construction, conceptually, the memorial is constructing two voids. We can go next. The memorial creates these two voids in the plaza conceptually, but within the space below the plaza, they're physical construction. The space below the plaza is where the museum is being built. Sorry, I'm getting a little. So when we approach it design-wise, as was mentioned earlier, we didn't have a formal narrative for a museum. There's a sequence of events that take place when planning a museum that that were a little out of sequence for this museum. So what we really had to react to as architects was the raw site, the authentic, and the memory of it. And we're going to keep going back to those words constantly through this presentation because that is really what drove us. But we thought about the site and what are the key functions of that site, or what are the key experiences on that site that we needed to preserve, that we needed to present to the public in the design of the museum. And we simplified that down to 3 very basic principles. And it came down to scale and void. The scale of the site, this 16-acre hole in the ground, was not only an unprecedented site in New York City, but it was also, in many ways, that size of a void was also, in some ways, a metaphor for all that we lost. Second concept was witness. We saw this going into the site from the very start during the early days in September 2001, walking down the West Side Highway, approaching a gate, a chain link fence that was shrouded in green construction mesh, and hundreds of people lining the roads, standing on the side of the road, offering words of encouragement as we were entering into the site. They were trying to peek through, trying to look over the fence, and this wasn't the kind of observation that you do when you're driving down the highway and you see a car accident and you instinctively turn your head. This was people that, this is my own personal interpretation, these are people that genuinely wanted to be part of what was going on inside. They wanted to help, they needed to be there, and if all they could do was to stand outside that gate, if that was all that they could do that day to help, that's what they were going to do. So people needed to actively participate in the site. When they could get closer to the site, they were able to stand on the perimeter and look into the void, look down onto the box columns, the footprints of the towers. They could ask themselves all the many questions that they had going through their heads, which I'm sure, like all of us, ranged emotionally across the board, but also the physical. They needed to understand the site. They needed to understand what was there and what was lost. And the third principle that we needed to design around was meaningful access. I remember walking down that construction ramp for the first time. Again, it's a threshold issue. As we moved down this construction ramp from the south side, from the plaza down to the lowest level of the site. It was 70 feet down, but that ramp was about 700 linear feet long. It was a steep ramp. It was in some ways physically exhausting, but it was more mentally exhausting. But it also allowed you to transition from that street level, from the city, down into the site. It gave you a certain amount of time to separate yourself from everything going on, prepare yourself mentally for what you were about to do on the lowest level. So meaningful access, I sometimes don't like to use words like honor and beauty, but there was a real honor to walk down that ramp. And it was just, everybody across the board generally will say the same thing, that it was special, and it was meaningful, and it was understood that you were entering into something important. And those are our 3 design principles. Carl will walk you through.
So it's a bit of a challenge to have a discussion about a project that people haven't seen. So what I'd like to do is, using really what are construction photos, walk you through a very brief sort of procession through the museum to give you a sense of the spaces and the character and the sort of narrative that those spaces evoke. And I think the first slide is of this. It's a diagram of what we call the ribbon, and it's actually the evolution of what Mark has described in terms of the ramp. It was, the idea that this sort of gradual descent was always an integral part of visiting the site, and it was a means by which people were able to adjust and bring themselves into the site. The ramp was used during all the 9/11 commemorations, and it really became, for us, one of the sort of touchstones for the design. And this ramp takes you from plaza level down 70 feet to the foundations. I might add here that the charge for the museum was to give public access to the foundations of the museum. That was really the physical driver. That was the driver of the historical party's agreement with the LMDC. So we had this technical problem. Yeah, we had to get people down 70 feet, but it was really, we thought, the opportunity to really make the transition and tell the story so that by the time people reached bedrock, we had, in a sense, given them the chance to connect with their own memories and experiences. So the next slide, I'll just take you quickly through a series. We start at the plaza. The tridents are located here. The tridents actually are the museum's marker at Plaza, because 90% of the museum that you'll see is below grade. So this is the chance for people to identify, and these are actually actively seen now by people who come to the memorial. People peer in, and they know the museum is below. And you descend from this level, from a level of daylight down to what we call the concourse lobby. This is a construction photo, so you don't see the wood floor. This is a very low, a very horizontal, a sheltered space. It's not one of these lofty, dramatic spaces that you might anticipate when you come downstairs. A lot of transactions happen here. People are getting their acoustic guide, they're asking for information, they're checking their coats. You still are sort of in the realm of daily life in the city. But what you do see at the distance are these notches, and this is your first, in a sense, disclosure or experience of what lies beyond. And it's something that we carefully thought about not wanting to reveal immediately, but this is a view to the South Tower, and you look down 70, or in this case about 60 or 55 feet, and you may or may not recognize this as the profile and the form of the South Tower. It's the envelope, I'll call it the positive expression of the South Pool, which you have just seen as you come down. But it certainly gives you the sense that there is a world down there and lets you begin to prepare yourself for encountering something right after you've done all the business of getting into a museum. So you continue through an introductory exhibit, which we're not really going to talk about, but I would give credit to the museum for really thinking about how people experience it. And that introductory exhibit is really about validating the memories that people have of where they were and what they heard and how they found out about the event. But as you move through this exhibit, you begin to come to the first overlook, which you see in the distance. And this is your first view of the slurry wall. And we were very much influenced by that site in the first 3 or 4 years. And we really wanted to capture what Mark has referred to, the idea of people outside looking in and trying to make sense and trying to orient themselves to what that space was. And the slurry wall is really probably it's certainly the largest and one of the most important artifacts on the site. So if you go to the next slide, just briefly, the slurry wall held back the lateral forces of earth and water in the site. And after the attacks, there was a lot of concern about whether it would hold, and it did hold, and the site did not give in, and it quickly became a metaphor for our own survival and perseverance, and Daniel Libeskind identified it as an artifact that required preservation. So it became a sort of important symbol, and I think an affirmative symbol. It's also a powerful, visually powerful artifact, which you can see in the next slide. Just raw and evocative and something that people react to very emotionally. And you see it very briefly from this overlook. And so it's probably one of the first experiences that begin to touch on your own memory and reaction. We continue down the ramp. This is a very early slide of the hall, which is now, you'll see in the very end, has been finished. It's the North Tower volume. So you saw that hint of the South Tower as you first came in. And now you reveal the scale of the North Tower. The North Tower is one of the two towers. It's the one that's most sort of substantially intact in terms of the museum envelope. And you see that full 210-foot scale. That's the size of the exact actual tower. And you move around this, and you keep proceeding. And one of the questions, and we can talk a little about it later if we want, is how do we want to render something like a tower volume, which we were sort of navigating between a reference that people can understand, but also the ambiguity and the mystery of letting people to read into it what they want. So the tower volume is aluminum. The towers The original trade towers were aluminum, but they're not expressed as replicas of the towers. They don't have the chamfer corners. They're not ribbed. They're really just very, very simplified forms that match the exact dimension of the tower. And we clad them in this industrial aluminum that has a very specular finish. And with our lighting designer, Paul Morantz, they're lit in a way that's very ethereal, very immaterial. And the idea was just to suggest this memory of the site, but not necessarily make it explicit. Next slide. So we'll continue down the ramp. We come down to the space between the two towers. You can go to the next slide. You land on the descent of the ribbon finally lands at the spot between the two towers. For many of us who lived in New York, you know, we always have a memory of being between those towers and how those two forms related to each other and the tension between those two corners. And we can continue, and this is the South Tower. You see the box beam column bases that are defined by the volume and the form of that floating metal box. In the distance, you also see the piece of the impact steel. This is where the plane hit the building, and the steel was actually identified in the pile of rubble where the actual impact point was. We also have the column bases are they're important in many ways because because of an historic resources agreement, we were obligated to preserve every one of these column bases that were existing, and that in a sense gave us the footprint for the building and really drove the sort of part of the diagram in the Partie. And we took also the opportunity to really excavate some of those and really show sort of some of the history of the building. But I would like to mention that it was potentially a challenge. There was always a temptation to make this a building about, a museum about the buildings. This is not a museum about the buildings, about the story, the events, and the people. So even something like this, which really puts a lot of emphasis on architecture and construction, is actually at the periphery of your experience. It's not really central to the main procession. So we'll keep moving pretty quickly. This is the return back. That overlook that you saw in the very early part, you can see that above. So people who are coming in can look down, but for the people who have reached bedrock and it's a much more contemplative environment, don't really see the bustle and activity of people upstairs as they're entering. And you can proceed. This is going towards the North Tower. The North Tower will house what we call the permanent exhibit, which is the most significant story of what happened in 9/11. So one of the things that you're already seeing in this procession is we have, and I give a lot of credit to the museum, their director and the curators. What we've experienced so far in this procession is a fairly sort of lightly installed experience. There are just a series of iconic objects. There's not a lot of narrative. There's not a lot of didactic information. It's really an opportunity for people to connect and relate to these objects with their own memories. The permanent exhibit is a much more explicit and narrative description of the events. Now you return to the what we call Foundation Hall. You see now the slurry wall from below. This will be once you leave the permanent exhibit and have gone through really the whole story of the attacks, the recovery, you'll come out to the space. Next slide. You also see the last column. Go one more slide. One more slide. One more slide. And this is really the last sort of major visual experience you have before you leave the museum. And the last column is, along with the slurry wall, is one of the other iconic artifacts. This was the last piece of steel to be removed from the site, and it was the location for a series of impromptu ad hoc memorials by the workers and the recovery and the first responders who were on the site at the time. And then from this, you leave the museum, you go back to the concourse, and then you emerge back into the memorial, which is, as I said, a very beautiful and tranquil sort of transition from the museum back to the realm of daily life. So just sort of to fold in what Stephen and Mark were talking about, I mean, we have a very interesting challenge here. There are many social history museums. Stephen mentioned several. And most of them are about events that were quite distant in the past. I mean, we were really dealing with something that not only as designers we were very conscious of and had all experienced, but we knew that at least for the first 20 years, most of our visitors were. So we really thought carefully of how do we allow people's own experiences and memory, help them navigate this site and this museum. And I think we tried on many levels, I think working one with the museum staff who are, I think, really our partners in this. We have this public sort of sequence which is very, I'll call it unforced in terms of message. It's really very much open to people's own interpretation. There's no judgment about what's the right thing to way to react or to feel, respond. I think the second thing that really helped us was having the luxury of space and time. It's a very large site, so the process of entering this museum is long, it's gradual, it allows you personal space, and the pace is such that you aren't really forced to confront anything in rapid fire. It's a very measured approach. And I think the last point, which is very difficult to articulate, and in fact, as an architect, we're not really used to talking about these things. We're used to drawing, designing, or shaping them. But it's trying to navigate this sort of challenge between specificity and ambiguity. The idea that the space can recall or evoke a sense of place or a memory, but not do so in an overly explicit or literal way. So the tower volumes are probably the easiest way of describing that. You know, that there should be, we hope, but we don't really need people to recognize that those are the tower volumes. And we don't want them to point at them and say, oh, that's the whole idea, that's the answer to, you know, that's why this museum makes sense. But at the same time, they need to create a context or a touchstone or a reference for one's own personal experience to, in a sense, come forward. So anyway, that was our short tour. Thanks. Not that short.
Thank you. Fascinating. Thank you very, very much. I have to tear my eyes away from the images and go look out at you. Thank you for these fascinating insights into not only into the museum space itself, but into the process by which it's designed and built. And just listening to you and watching the images, I have such a flood of associations that it's hard to disentangle them to come to one specific question. There's one half-question comment and then one very specific question about the process. And the comment is on your last point about you want to evoke a memory without necessarily being overtly explicit. And that resonates very well with what's been called the architecture of trauma, because one of the difficulties in trying to represent the unrepresentable is exactly giving some kind of shape to the gap between the event itself and the remembering of that event. And that's when architecture tries to capture that gap. In recent times, it tends to do that through sort of non-redemptive, uncanny, or abstract forms that try to evoke emotion without necessarily relying on visitors' own experience in order to bring out that emotion. And one of the ways this is achieved at other sites and here as well, you mentioned the aluminum tower volume cladding, has been through the strategic use of materials to evoke emotion without necessarily being explicit about specific experiences. So for example, at the Berlin Wall site, there's a large use of a particular kind of rust-colored steel called Corten steel. And at the voids in the Berlin Jewish Museum, it's the raw concrete which helps get across the sort of unlocatable emptiness of those sites. So one thing I would be interested in hearing a bit more about is about the role of materials in this attempt to create an emotional space that is at the same time not directly tied to one's own experience. And then a slightly different question. maybe Steve, you can take this one up and the other ones can chime in, is as you were talking at the beginning, you mentioned that you'd like this to be, as all architects do, a story that will tell itself in the future, generations from now, when we are no longer here. And as you were saying that, I was thinking, well, yes, the idea might be for the story to tell itself, but a design doesn't happen by itself. And it's rarely the case that there is really only one person behind a design. We're quite used to the idea of the starchitect as the image of how these kind of amazing projects get built. But the three of you here are indicative of a much larger team, and I would be very curious to hear you reflect a bit on the collaborative process. What does it mean to work together both among yourselves as architects on such a complicated process, and how do you mesh that with working collaboratively with other actors that are part of the process as well? So I think I'll leave it there.
That's a lot of questions.
You want to do the materials first?
Let's start with the beginning of the question and move forward. I think Carl's use of the word ambiguity is really important. Because abstraction in the face of this kind of harsh reality requires a kind of entropy, because there is no attempt to remove the authentic nature of the project, or to create a kind of caricatural representation of objects and buildings and events and lives, and so I think that the balance, right, Carl? I mean, between this kind of abstraction, ambiguity, and a harsh reality is really important. You want to?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to let Mark also chime in, because I think your question about materials was interesting, because we don't have to. We weren't looking to use raw materials to heighten a sense of emotion. I think, in fact, we almost had the opposite problem. We needed to use materials to balance the rawness of the space.
I think that's a good point. Balance was something that we struggled a little bit with. I mean, the site is raw, and it evokes a very raw and difficult emotion. But to remain true to that, we wanted to preserve that. And in many ways, our architecture isn't there to be the statement. The statement is the site. The site itself can be considered an artifact in some ways. It's this historic site, and it is the largest artifact that was collected. The architecture is really a means to experience that through this progressive disclosure, as Stephen mentioned earlier, this gradual unveiling of the site and gradual experience of the spaces. We believe and hope that will allow people who didn't experience 9/11 firsthand to get a sense of the gravity of the situation, the gravity of the event, and the size of the event. Through this difficult site, and we consciously made an effort that this ramp is going to be something almost a little bit more comforting. It cradles the visitor in a way. It's a means to move through this difficult, emotional, and raw site. And by that we chose more familiar materials. We have a wood floor and wood walls, almost residential in that kind of comforting way. But the ramp is not about looking at the ramp is about looking beyond the ramp. And early in the design process, we talked about experiences such as hiking through a forest. And while you're in the dark shadow of the tree canopy, you emerge at a point where you have this beautiful vista and you can look beyond, and the dark tree canopy and the dark forest frames that view, but you're not looking at the shadow, you're looking out at the mountain beyond. And what we're trying to do is create this cradle that takes you through and then provides you a view of the slurry wall. We have our tower volumes, which are clad in in aluminum, and they're referential to the original towers, but they're abstract. They don't have the chamfered corners. They don't look like tower volumes. You know, we think that people understand the scale of those volumes, and it might not click with everybody that they are actually the tower volumes, but we hope that it will in some ways. But it's also not about the tower volumes. As we've said earlier, the museum is not there about the buildings, the museum is there about the people, but it's undeniable to ignore that the buildings were there. So in our ramp, which snakes through the site and wraps around and goes and leads the visitor in different directions, you're always kind of revolving around these tower volumes, but your focus is out from the ramp, and the tower volumes are always almost in your peripheral. They become this fuzzy memory, this use of material, which is somewhat refined, but as Carl said, in the way we're lighting it, it almost dematerializes. It's maybe not the strongest metaphor, or maybe it's an obvious metaphor, but in the same way that our memories fade over time, these tower volumes are fuzzy remembrance of the tower itself.
Stephen, do you want to talk about how we collaborate?
Shulin. You know, good clients make good projects. I'll come back to that. The notion of the signature stroke of a pen by a singular architect is, in terms of our practice, nonsense. And we make a lot of decisions in a project. I think a typical project has probably 500,000 decisions that get made at a large-scale project, and this one probably had tenfold. So we celebrate collaboration, and we don't want to leave anything on the table. So without allowing active participation by all of the members of the project team, the extended members of the project team, I think you risk leaving an awful lot on the table. So that's how we feel about collaboration.
Is this on? Yeah. One of the things that I've been thinking about as part of this discussion is the degree to which the story of September 11th, which we often think of as a story about terrorism and global politics and memory, is also really a story about architecture, right? It's a story that really begins back with the building of the World Trade Center, and it's a story in which we see in very profound ways the way that buildings become symbolic, not necessarily in accurate ways, but in ways that stand in for much, much broader concepts than they are themselves. And I think one of the things that I just wanted to take note of is the way in which, after September 11th, there was this extraordinary response in the architecture and design community, both through formal and informal kinds of competitions in which proposals were put forward for the renewal, not only the memorialization at the site, but also for the renewal of this site of 16 acres in Lower Manhattan. And I'll just note that one of the things that I was very struck by was the way in which so many of those proposals were about twos and twinness and kind of a reworking of the towers themselves and what we can only think of as a kind of architecture that's about grief and mourning. And I think we're now at a very different moment in that story of architecture where a lot of these designs are now being realized and over the next few years will be completed. And this is a very, very important moment within that following the opening of the memorial. And I think we have many different kinds of examples of architecture at this site now, not simply the memorial, but also the tower of One World Trade Center and the other towers that are being built at the site. And I think that this is renewal of many different kinds. It's renewal as a kind of response to grief. It's also a renewal of commerce, of office life. It's also a renewal of the everyday in very important ways. And I think that the chargedness of the site has been so profound that one of the things that will be very interesting for us to see going forward is whether or not the museum retains that chargedness, charged quality, while the surrounding parts of the site emerge more into the everyday. And so I'm wondering if you want to say something about that sort of question of renewal. One of the things that you've described here that's very important about this particular museum is the way in which it is a museum as much to the site and the important aspects of the site as it is to the objects within it. And I will be very interested to see in the critical response and also the response of the public how subtle the design is to them or how much they read the design. It seems like you're fine with it being subtle as well as it being noticed. People are likely to go right to the objects, but in fact what you're talking about is a very subtle shaping of their passage through the space, shaping of a kind of trajectory through the space, and also using materials to shape people's response to it in ways that they may or may not actually be conscious of. And so you might also want to say something about your thinking about the thresholds too. Yeah.
Sure. I do want to say that one of the lessons we've learned over the last few months is when we give tours, not to really give a tour, but to watch people. In fact, this was sort of awkward because rarely have we had to literally explain step by step what people are seeing. It's actually fascinating for us just to sort of give a little introduction at the staircase and then watch what people learn and how and the questions they ask us. You mentioned thresholds, and I think it was an interesting challenge for us because there's a series of transitions that happen, and we really thought carefully about when we make those transitions sharp and distinct and when we make them soft and gradual. I mean, typically a threshold, it's the door from the inside of something to the outside of something. It really represents a sort of sharp change in environment or character. And we have a few of those, but when the more you think about the strategy, it's really about a sort of a gradual change or awareness as you move through this ramp. This ribbon that we call the ribbon it's about 1 in 20, so it's not even steep enough to be a ramp. It's sloped just gently enough that it propels you a little bit through the space, and it seems a little bit unfamiliar, but what happens is that you move and you see something in distance and it grows larger, and then you're at the overlook. So it's nothing that you encounter abruptly. And I think that ties into the notion of people of trying, and once again, it sounds so prescriptive, but allowing people to begin to engage with their memory at a pace that may be different for different people. But there are a few places where there is a sort of a strong distinction, and I think primarily that has to do at Bedrock, where we have the footprints, and it emerged very early in the design, especially talking with survivors and family members, that the sort of the line of being inside that tower and outside that tower was sort of a line of those who lived and those who didn't. Oh, this is, okay. I'm Carl Krebs speaking.
I'm Steve Davis.
And my colleague Mark Wagner. But that line was actually a very important line to the people who had either lost people in the event, and it became important for that threshold to be something that was much more clear and conscious. And so the edge of that tower footprint is very clearly defined. There's actually even a depression where the columns are, and you cross a bridge or a platform. And so the idea of articulating when a threshold is meaningful in terms of what it signifies versus, I'll call it a more gradual transition.
Introduce yourself.
I'm Brigitte Sion, and I'd like to look at another, what I think is an architectural challenge that you showed us with the images earlier, and that is the numerous functions that the museum will take on. Not just a museum as we think of it in a more traditional sense of displaying objects and panels and artifacts, but I'm thinking of, as you mentioned, the site specificity of it, which makes it used as a cemetery or as a shrine, especially given the fact that in this particular tragedy, most bodies have not been recovered, and so relatives of victims need a place to feel close to the victims. Another dimension is a site of mourning and of grief, not only for the immediate relatives, but for the larger community. And so as a side question, I'm wondering, how is the museum different from the memorial above, since the memorial has this obvious function of serving as a site of mourning and a site of grieving? It is also an education center. You mentioned that some parts of the exhibit have a clearly didactic goal. And because we're in New York and because it's a monumental disaster and a monumental undertaking in general, it's going to be one of the major tourism destinations in the weeks and months and years to come. So that also involves very large fluxes of visitors and large flows. So as architects, if you could tell us a little more about those challenges, both of the multiple functions of the museum and also the multiple and overlapping and competing audiences that will be sharing the space at the same time, not with the same intention and not with the same needs.
Let me try to summarize 10 years of experience.
Hold it closer.
Is this better? Okay. Let me try to summarize 10 years of experience with this site, and actually far longer than that. The site, the memorial and the museum and the entry pavilion are going to function as an integrated experience. And so as such, the visitors have lots of decisions to make. You can call them threshold, you can call them transformations, but people have to decide how fully engaged they want to become with this experience. So we imagine that there will be people who will simply come and visit the memorial and have an experience on this plaza, which is going to mature into an incredible public amenity over the years, and eventually it will be fully open access. But then there's a further decision to be made to visit the museum, and then several decisions throughout the visit of the museum about how engaged we want to become. So I think that because the facility is large enough to accommodate a variety of program, that these demands for different kinds of interaction and engagement will be satisfied over time. Carl, would you think of that?
Yeah, I think that you did. I think you did sort of point to the complementary character of the memorial and the museum. On a more, I'll call it, practical level, you're right. Museums have a lot of activity, and not all of it is solemn or sacred. And how do you design a building that has the repository of remains? It has extremely difficult and painful experiences with the normal transactional quality of going into museum and meeting your family, of collecting people, and I think that I'll go back to that idea of having the luxury of space and time to bring people into the museum, that we're able to detach some of that activity from the true encounter at bedrock of some of the more sensitive artifacts, which if in a traditional museum where we didn't have this multi-acre footprint and this 70 feet of descent, it would be a lot more challenging, to enter, from a lobby into an exhibit that covers some of the material that we would have, we have to deal with in this museum would have been, I think, much more daunting and difficult to achieve.
Maybe just on how different it is for laboratory.
Oh, well, I think you talked about the memorial, and I think the memorial is an incredibly moving and successful piece of landscape and architecture. And it really takes, it universalizes the experience. The names are there. The names are not organized in an obvious way about who, and there was an intention on the part of the designers to sort of, to see the sort of the magnitude and the event as something that we all share in. And there was a challenge because I think many people, many family members wanted something more tactile or more personal about their loved one, and it just was difficult to achieve at the memorial. And so the museum has, at least, not only does it tell stories as part of the narrative in the exhibits, there is the memorial exhibit down below, which allows people to access the pictures, the stories, the names, the mementos, the event, the people on a more individual basis. So it, in a sense, it complements the memorial above in a different way, in a different level.
Well, thank you. We have a whole slew of really fascinating questions, and I thank the ushers for collecting them, the audience for writing them, and Alexander Delano, my colleague, for sorting them by topic. And it turns out that they do fall into several nice categories. And the first actually is something that I sort of feel silly that I didn't ask you myself when we met last week, which was about the exterior of the building. And also, it's so not only in and of itself the exterior of the building, but also the exterior of the building in its relationship to the surrounding site. What does the exterior actually? How do you see it relating to the surrounding site or to the site below?
There's a simple answer to that.
We didn't design the pavilion.
Aha, well there you go. Then perhaps I don't feel so silly for not having asked it in the first place. But that's very good to know. Okay, next question. Very easy. Sometimes you ask a simple question, you get a simple answer.
But you did think about when people enter in the pavilion, their experience is different than when they go down below, right? I mean, it's kind of glass and airy, and there's going to be a restaurant, right?
Yeah, and also I have to say there's a lot of, there is unfortunately a lot of security that will happen when you enter the building. So that happens at the pavilion.
Thank you. So then let me ask another question about your process, which also was raised in part by some questions, and I'll just flesh it out a little bit based on our conversation. I'm actually personally fascinated by the restrictions that you had to work with. And I'm wondering about sort of if you could tell us a little bit about what the requirements were that you were given and how that influenced your shaping of the site.
So I think architects love constraints sometimes because it gives you something to
You do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that in many ways the requirements we had created this museum, and also I think it preserved it through a very long, arduous process of design. And there are a couple key ones. You saw the slurry wall, for example. Well, there were a handful of historic in situ artifacts that remained after the recovery effort. Chief among them was this expansive slurry wall, which we had to provide access to, and that gave us, in a sense, it gave us the volume, it gave us height, or section as we call it. And the other significant constraint were the requirement that we provided meaningful public access to both the north and the south footprints and as many of those columns as possible. And that gave us breadth or plan or the footprint of this museum. And those two actually allowed us to create the volume, the space, the sequence, and the descent that's so vital. And frankly, for me, if we were given a program to put 100,000 square feet on a plaza, we would have never been able to, I think, have achieved this spatial sort of, it's a very unique experience. And so we were, I think, in a way, those two constraints created the museum.
Now let me tell you why I don't think we were constrained. I think that the opportunity to create a facility which is in many ways the inverse of a traditional museum. I would argue that a traditional museum is an icon which contains exhibits. This museum, the exhibits are the icon. So we don't have a facade, which is an interesting question, Laura. You asked about the exterior. We really don't have an exterior. And for many years, progress was being made in the development and construction of the site, but it was out of sight. It's an iceberg being built from the bottom up. And the memorial, which we were involved in up to our eyeballs, was going to be in place, and once it was in place, there would be no access for serious construction below. So the development of this integrated place happened gradually, but it started a long time ago. So it's been really it's been about a third of my career.
Want to add anything, Mark? You don't
I think
have
that
to.
kind of got it all. I think that the real constraints, I agree with Carl. I don't like constraints either, Stephen, but the real constraints here, the reality of our site boundaries really did dictate a certain volume that we needed to preserve, which if you were reading the papers anywhere between 2004 and, well, now, you know that this project has been under constant questioning. Not always good. But the reality is, I think one of the strongest parts of our design was that throughout it all, because we had these constraints, we were able to maintain our partie. Our concept for the museum has remained constant, because we could always fall back on these requirements or these constraints, which sounds like a negative word, but these requirements of the site allowed us to preserve our initial design intent. And that does go back to these three concepts, which are scale and witness and descent.
Thank you. So I have, just to shift gears for a little bit from the architecture. I am actually an art historian, so I'm rather partial to talking about architecture, but I'd also, but some of the questions are sort of broader that I'm wondering if maybe our colleagues might also be able to chime in a bit, which is questions about things like authenticity or healing, these sort of larger questions. To what extent do you, or to what extent can a site claim to be authentic? To what extent can a site claim to be or wish to be a site that will affect some sort of change in, and is this something that's desirable, not desirable? I don't know. I'm wondering if any of the, Brigitte looks like she might have something to say. Oh, Marita has something to say.
Well, everybody likes to debate the concept of authenticity, but I think really the key here is the site specificity, right? And early on you mentioned a couple of other examples of memorial museums that are not at specific sites. And I think that this site, the site of Ground Zero, would be very interesting to see if that name lasts through the opening of all of these spaces and buildings. It's so charged, right? It's such, there is so much invested in this site in so many different ways, right? There's a lot of sense of ownership over it. There's a kind of overdetermination of the meanings at the site, and so I think that in thinking about this design in terms of authenticity, part of what you're talking about is, what is somebody going to feel when they're down standing on that platform with the slurry wall, which very few people have actually come up close to, with the slurry wall right there in front of them, and the sort of sense that the site itself conveys all that is invested in it, all of these emotions that we invest in it, that it's almost like a kind of stand-in for all of the sense of loss and trauma and the complexity of this event. So in that sense, I think that the museum, the specificity of the place, and that it is a museum as much to the site as it is to the objects in it, is a really important part of the design.
I would just add something that I find interesting. You spoke earlier of, was it progressive or incremental disclosure in your design? And I think the site of Ground Zero, to call it still like this, for now, has gone from total obscurity immediately after the attacks, when even if you wanted to see something, there was nothing to see. Even if you went up those platforms, there was really nothing to see. And then we're going to, once we get to the completion of the whole site, as you were mentioning, Steve, there will be a point where the whole plaza will be an open space. There will be no lines and coming and go and specific predetermined itinerary to get there. So we'll get from the total closure to a completely open space. And then there's another dimension, which is, we talked about the towers being iconic, the whole area of Lower Manhattan being iconic in its own ways. And by the time all of these various buildings are done, we'll have a different landscape, a completely different view of things, a different Lower Manhattan. It echoes what you were talking about, renewal. And so I think it's also interesting to think in those, in terms of gaze, in terms of open and close, in terms of almost like, dark and light, or because we're going to have something completely different.
Very quickly, authenticity is connected very deeply to the sense of trust. And I think that's important for this site in particular, too.
Can you elaborate on that?
In the sense that a visitor wants some kind of reassurance that what they're seeing is not manipulated. And even if the authentic has to be preserved and is therefore no longer as found, the ways in which you've talked about making sure that things are exactly where they were rather than even a few feet off has a lot to do with how you feel people will trust what they encounter there. So I think there's a connection to trust there that's important.
This makes me think of another question that I thought you might want to say something about, which is when we spoke before, you talked a lot about how much infrastructure there is there, right? That there's the PATH train, the subway, there's all this sort of stuff that's hidden around the site, right? And so to a certain extent, that the experience of the museum needs also not to sort of show all else that's underground in that area, and what a challenge that was, perhaps. I guess you're going to feel the subway trains go by, maybe, in the museum, yeah?
You're going to hear them.
You hear them?
There'll be a rumble, and we had long discussions with, I'm seeing Jan, but some other people from the museum, and it's, we in the end felt that it was part of the history of that site, and I told you earlier, we had this volume and this sort of area that we were able to work with, but we were also negotiating tooth and nail with the other tenants and the other functions down there to preserve as much that interstitial space that we needed. So that was many years ago, and we've sort of moved on. But now that you asked the question, yes, that was probably a huge part of our labors in the beginning of the project.
There was a very primary goal of ours to protect the truth in the way the site was redeveloped, at least our part of the site. You could have moved the memorial around at the plaza level without revealing the manipulation. But because of what we decided to do below, the precision of the alignment was a fundamental obligation. Because when you have a chance to experience this, you'll see it instantly. You will feel it.
It was always part of our thought process, our understanding of the site, knowing that in this 16-acre site, it's incredibly complicated. Like I said, there's subway stations, there's mechanical plants, there's all these other necessities, all these things that have to go into the site. So we knew that the site was going to fill in. But when we stripped it down, we also understood or recognized that there was a need to preserve enough open space to convey the meaning, to preserve the attitude and the emotion and the experience of the site as we all felt it as the entire 16-acre site, although we knew it wasn't going to remain that way.
Thank you. So several of the questions revolved around, I'm going to sort of lump these together, what was sort of unique about this opportunity, I'll call it, unique in terms of the constituencies that you were working with, unique in terms of the goals that you were seeking to achieve, unique in terms of the historical significance of what you were doing. And I guess I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, and then also about the question of what have you learned from this, and sort of what of this will you take away into your next projects, hopefully none of which will be quite as monumental. I mean, not that I don't wish upon you monumental projects, but hopefully your next project might be a little simpler.
We're working on other things all the time. Mm-hmm. And we hope that each project that we do will be in some way better than the last. This will be very hard as an experience to improve on. We are optimistic that we've made mostly the right decisions. Nobody hits 400 in baseball anymore.
Not since they eliminated steroids. Sorry.
What are we going to do the day after this opens? It's preoccupied our thoughts. What are we going to do on day 2?
I think that the lessons we've learned from this project are, in almost every project, they were just intensified to such a degree that we couldn't escape them or avoid them. And every site has a history. Sometimes, you wear it on your sleeve, like the Trade Center, and it becomes a really important part that generates your idea. I did a competition recently at the National Mall, and it was at the base of the Capitol, and there were 200 years of plans and ideas.
You won.
Congratulations.
Yeah, we won that competition, but it went back to the stream bed that went through, that was channeled into a water feature by L'Enfant to establish the sort of initial overlay, and then the Olmsted landscape, and all these things were part of that site history. And I think for me, it's become more of a goal with every project to really try to extract those legacies and to see how we can how we actually build upon them or refer to them, even if people don't necessarily make those connections, if we can somehow make those linkages. I think in the case of the Trade Center, it was just so sudden, so raw, and so personal that it was inescapable.
One of the things that I think links us together, Davis Brody Bond, is that in a lot of ways we like puzzles. We like big projects. We like complicated projects. And Steve is always reminding me that design is really about solving problems. It's taking a series of issues and figuring out the right sequential approach to piece them together. And I think what Carl is saying, and I think agree 100% with it, is that no stone should go unturned. We want to understand everything that's leading up to that problem or that issue. And this was certainly an intense project, and hopefully the next one will be a little bit simpler, but at the root of it, we like puzzles.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm thinking that I should probably turn over now to Jonathan Bach, the chair of Global Studies, because we're almost at 6:30, and you have room for one more question? Excellent. We have time for one more question. So let me see. Whoops. What about, so several of the questions do have to do, again, with the question of what was unique about this and about the process and about the constituencies. I mean, you've said several times now that a great client, I believe you said, makes a great project. But who was your client in this case? And how do you, in fact, I mean, how did you navigate? You must have had, the whole world was your client in a way. So how did you navigate the various constituencies? And
Well, our client didn't exist prior to September 11, 2001.
Say that again?
Our client didn't
Your client,
exist
right.
prior to September 11th. And everybody was learning everything at the same time, about everything. There was very little complimentary press about the site or its redevelopment for many years. So we just had to keep our heads down and keep going, wouldn't you say, guys?
Yeah, I think we had obviously many constituents. We had family members, preservationists, community members, politicians, donors, agencies. We had, I would say though, of all the the one client that I think deserves a lot of credit in this process is the staff of the museum. And as Stephen mentioned, or may have mentioned, they came on board into the process, and we were fortunate that there was a sort of a common sensibility, a respect, and a common vision. And without that, it would have fallen apart quite easily. But
you were in place before they were hired.
we were in place, and I think as Mark and Stephen and I have said, the framework for this museum existed. The concept of its scale, the volumes, the descent, and one of the things that we actually had thought about in anticipating that we didn't have a fully vetted museum or an exhibit designer was the notion, which you didn't see very much in the presentation, of the north footprint being a sort of an enclosed and relatively separate exhibit environment, which allowed that program to be developed sort of somewhat independently at a later time, and that what we'll call the interstitial or public spaces being a much more, I'll call it lightly narrated, emotive, and atmospheric kind of exhibit. And we fortunately had a client who actually agreed with that as a concept. It started out as a little bit of a practical strategy, but I don't think this museum would be at all the same if we had that descent, literally layered with, exhibit, narrative, content, audio, visual. It would have just been a totally different experience. And so it was a combination of a strategy that we worked out as a default, in terms of the circumstances, but I think one that when we met the new director, Alice Greenwald, and her staff, they really understood. and bought into.
One of the important, I think, elements of what we strategized with our client was the ability for evolution in the exhibit narrative. So, the hard stuff isn't going to change over time. If you look at the pool volumes, what you don't immediately understand is that the first 27 feet down from the memorial is water, but there are pump rooms that drive those fountains, and they're pumping 37,000 gallons a minute per pool, and we're headed for a LEED Gold project. So there's a lot. There's a lot that is kind of out of sight that will not particularly change over time. But there is the ability to accommodate quite a bit in other areas.
Jonathan?
So I guess the time really, really flies, and that's my signal that we have to start wrapping things up. And when the next, to make way for the class that's going to come in here in about 15 minutes, students will start walking in, and it takes us a little while to get out. While I was thinking about this, I had ran across aphorism by Kierkegaard, not a noted architect, but he once wrote that life can only be understood backwards, but lived forwards. And it somehow, thinking about this site and the images that you've showed us, made me think about how architects inhabit precisely this medium, this physical space caught between understanding backwards and living forwards. Because especially for this space here, your intention to allow people to remember and reflect is very much part of understanding backwards. And it's a space that's supposed to be visited for generations, and it's very much a part of living forwards. And that's a very complex place to inhabit in any context. And in this one, it's particularly moving and noteworthy. So I'd just like to say a very big thank you to all three of you, to Steve, Mark, and Carl, to Marita and Brigitte and Laura, and to Jeffrey and the staff. And I hope that we have the opportunity in various ways to continue this conversation with you, the audience, and with you, the architects. So thank you very much.